Okay, and with that, let's go ahead and get started. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another Mass Medic webinar. Today, we're discussing building a new medical device or evolving an existing one with regulations in mind. This webinar is hosted by Goodwin, and we have wonderful speakers with us today. Goodwin partner Stephanie Philbin, FDA Regulatory Strategy, and Goodwin partner Matt Wetzel, HHS Regulatory and Commercial Strategy. My name is Anna King. I'm a marketing coordinator for Mass Medic. And if you're not familiar, we're a medical device trade association in New England. And we work to improve the industry through education, events like this, awareness, connection, and advocacy. So before we begin, quick note, we will be taking questions throughout the webinar. So please feel free to drop those in the chat and we'll do our best to answer those. But without further ado, I'll pass it over to Stephanie and Matt. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Good morning, everybody. And again, I'm Stephanie Philbin. I'm a partner in Goodwin's FDA practice group based in DC along with Matt, and we're happy to talk with you today. If you want to move the next slide. And so we're going to start with the FDA regulatory considerations. These are things to be thinking about if you're developing a new device or if you're modifying an existing device. Next slide, please. And importantly, devices are classified by FDA, and they're classified based on their risk and also what's known about the device and the degree of control that's necessary to reasonably assure safety and effectiveness. So I've got three pictures here, and of course we move from left to right in terms of risk of the device and classification. So on the left, we have a typical class 1 510K exempt device, stethoscope. Then we go all over the way to the right, and an implantable pacemaker. Obviously, there are more risks involved with that device, and FDA wants more information before it goes on the market. So again, devices come in all shapes and sizes, intended uses, and depending on the device and how it's classified dictates what testing needs to be conducted, and also if a marketing authorization needs to be submitted, or application or a 510K needs to be submitted to FDA. Next slide, please. So I've listed out here the differences between the three classes of devices. Class 1 are your lowest risk devices. They are subject to what are called the general controls of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Thus, you can't adulterate or misbrand your device. Adulteration could include having a manufacturing facility that's not in proper shape. A misbranding violation could be if you fail to submit a medical device report if there's an adverse event involving the device. All devices are, and manufacturers of all devices are subject to facility establishment registration. Thus, that's the way FDA knows where manufacturers are located and can go and inspect. Additionally, all devices are subject to listing. The manufacturer identifies for FDA what device it's putting into commercial distribution. Another general control is labeling requirements. Your labeling can't be false or misleading. It has to have certain requirements that are laid out in the regulations. Devices are subject to what's called the quality system regulation, which is the device version of GMPs. There are some exceptions there, but all devices, even if they're exempt from most of the QSR requirements, all devices are subject to complaint handling and also to the record keeping requirement of the QSR. Reporting obligations, those include medical device reports, which I mentioned, and also 806 reports, which are reports to FDA if you have a correction or removal that presents a risk to health. And then lastly, the last general control is pre-market notification, or what's commonly called 510Ks. Most class 1 devices are exempt from 510K requirements, but there are some class 1 devices that do need to be submitted to FDA through a 510K or a pre-market notification. Now, class 2 devices are subject to the FDCA's general controls, which we just talked about. And importantly, some class 2 devices are 510K exempt, but a lot of them do require 510Ks. Class 2 devices are also subject to what are called special controls, and this can take the form of post-market surveillance. It can take the form of a guidance document that lays out specific requirements for the type of device. Finally, class 3 devices. These are your highest risk, your life-supporting or life-sustaining devices. And these, for the most part, require PMA approval. Next slide, please. Now, I want to talk briefly about design controls. And so design controls are part of FDA's quality system regulation, which is at 21 CFR Part 820. And again, the QSR is the device version of GMPs. And the QSR basically requires manufacturers to develop methods to make sure that they can manufacture safe and effective devices in a reproducible and consistent manner. The QSR is applicable to manufacturers of finished devices, which can include an accessory that's suitable for use if you think of a hemodialysis tubing. It doesn't cover component manufacturers, but FDA could still pursue an allegation against a component manufacturer through the FDCA. Now, importantly, non-compliance with the QSR could lead to an allegation of adulteration under 501H of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And as you may be aware, FDA this past February proposed a rule to align the QSR with the ISO standard 13485. So that's more to come on that. We haven't seen the final rule and probably won't for a little bit, but that's definitely something to keep an eye on. Now, importantly, design controls, these are located in 21 CFR 820.30 of the QSR. And these apply to class 2 and class 3 devices. They don't apply to most class 1 devices, although there is a list in the regulation of about 4 or 5 that design controls do apply to. And also, if you have a class 1 device that's automated with software, it would be subject to design controls. So what are design controls? They're basically methods and procedures that FDA wants manufacturers to implement to make sure that you build quality into the design of your device. So it can include design inputs, which are physical and performance characteristics of a device. And FDA, if you want to learn more about this, FDA actually has a good PowerPoint on its website, specifically on design controls. And the example they use of design input is if you want to make a device that's portable, well, what are your inputs? It might be the dimensions of the device. It might be the weight of the device. And so then, of course, as you're developing your design at various stages, you want to conduct a review. You want to verify that by objective evidence that the design output meets the input. So verification, as in FDA's words, is sort of a check the box that I made the product correctly, versus validation, which is really to make sure that the device, the specs of the device conform to user needs and intended uses, which is sort of like the manufacturer confirming I made the correct device for the intended use. There's also design transfer, when you're basically changing the input or moving the input and the output, the requirements of the device into production specifications. And then also, if after you market your device, you want to make changes to the design, then you want to go through a process to make sure those are correctly documented, implemented, and that they basically the changes work as you intended. And you put all this documentation into your design history file. So next slide, please. So once you've designed your device, you may need to do a certain amount of testing. And for probably all devices, there's going to be some preclinical or non-clinical testing, which is bench or performance testing. FDA's regulations for GLPs, good laboratory practices, are found at 21 CFR Part 58. Now, some devices may require clinical testing. And unlike in the drug world where you may hear about phases of testing, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, the device terms are more feasibility or a pilot test. And then a larger test would be considered a pivotal. And those pivotal tests are likely going to need to be listed on clinicaltrials.gov, which is the database of clinical trials maintained by the National Library of Medicine over at NIH. So if you are conducting clinical testing of a device, what you need to be cognizant of is FDA's IDE regulation, which is the Investigational Device Exemption Regulation found at Part 812 of FDA's regs. And this basically exempts a device from the various FDCA requirements, and it allows the device to be moved in interstate commerce to, in fact, be tested. And again, even though it's an exemption, design controls are required for all devices, including IDE devices. Now, importantly, clinical testing also requires that you be aware of other protective regulations. So, for example, if you're conducting a clinical test, you have to have adequate informed consent for your study subjects. And that the regulations there are found in Part 50 of 21 CFR. You also need to be cognizant of the financial disclosure by clinical investigators regulations found at Part 54. And this basically is a way for FDA to be aware of if there's any financial arrangement that rises to a certain level between a clinical trial sponsor and a clinical investigator. FDA wants to be aware of that so that the agency can make sure that that financial arrangement didn't bias the results of the study. And also, studies are subject to institutional review board oversight. IRBs are either affiliated with the site or a manufacturer could reach out to a central IRB. And IRBs look at the informed consent, make sure it's adequate and that patients' subjects' rights are protected, and also looks at the investigational plan. Next slide, please. Now, for devices, in terms of whether you need to submit an IDE application to FDA, the question is whether the device is a significant risk device. And significant risk devices are defined in FDA's IDE regulations. It's one that presents a potential for serious risks to the health and safety or welfare of a subject. So if your device is considered significant risk, then you do need to submit an IDE application to the agency. You'd include your protocol, you'd include any information you have from either non-clinical studies, or if there have been other clinical investigations of the device, perhaps outside the US. And you also describe your manufacturing process and your facilities. FDA is required, or does have to either approve or disapprove the IDE. FDA has 30 days to do so. And the agency can also conditionally approve a device or an IDE, I should say, which means that it may permit the study to proceed, but there may be certain restrictions on it. Now, once an IDE application is approved, manufacturers may need to submit IDE supplements if they make changes to the device. And there's also an annual report obligation. Next slide, please. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I can see my slides. Now, for non-significant risk devices, these are not defined by FDA's regulations. They're basically devices other than significant risk devices. No IDE application is needed, but you work as a clinical trial sponsor, works exclusively with the IRB, which again is looking at the protocol, it's looking at the informed consent form. If you have a question about whether your device is a significant risk or non-significant risk device, you can submit through FDA's Q submission program a request for a study risk determination letter. Now, importantly, for all investigational devices, whether you're significant risk or not significant risk, a trial sponsor can't promote or test market the investigational device or unduly prolong a clinical trial or represent that the device is safe and effective for the use being investigated. It's very important to not make any claims, whether it's in your press release or on your website, that overstate the product, because remember, at this stage, you don't know whether your product works. So that's an important limitation and consideration. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you've made it through your clinical testing, if you've in fact had to do clinical testing, the question is, how do you get on the market? So again, there are what's called 510K exempt devices. These, again, are most class 1 devices, such as the manual stethoscope. But there are some class 1 devices that do require a 510K. And basically, these are referred to as the reserve devices. If the use is of substantial importance in preventing impairment, or if the device presents a potential unreasonable risk of illness or injury. And so I've listed out some examples here, because I know I gave this presentation one time and somebody asked, well, what are some examples? I thought, well, I'm going to list them here. So these, again, are just a few. There's about 150, 160 of these class 1 devices that do need a 510K. Now, importantly, if you are 510K exempt, you can just get on the market, but you do need to register your facility, list your device. You would be subject to complaint handling. So you have to be cognizant of these other regulatory requirements. Now, if you are not 510K exempt, that means you have to submit a 510K or a pre-market notification to FDA. There is also a third-party review program eligible for which some devices are eligible. The 510K would describe the proposed class that you think your device falls within. You'd cite your proposed indications, describe your device, and you'd cite a predicate device, which is the device that's legally available on the market and is a class 1 or class 2 device. And you'd basically make a comparison of your device to the predicate. Now, there are several types of 510Ks. The original or type of 510K is what's called the traditional 510K. But you may also be able to do what's called an abbreviated 510K, where you're making a declaration of conformity to recognized standards. Or you can do what's called a special 510K, which basically allows you to have a shorter review, but it's only for certain device modifications. Next slide, please. Now, 510Ks do come with a user fee, and I've got the amounts listed here. It's about $13,000 for standard 510K. If you qualify as a small business, it's around $3,000. Once you submit a 510K, FDA has 15 calendar days to determine whether it's going to accept it, whether it looks substantively complete for the agency to continue with its review. The agency targets 90 days to make a determination of whether or not to grant the 510K clearance. Doesn't always hit that target, sometimes comes in under, sometimes it's considerably longer. And if FDA does Grant a clearance, what that is, it's an order finding that the device is substantially equivalent to a marketed device to your predicate. Now, on the flip side, if you get a not substantially equivalent determination, you cannot market your device. So what is substantial equivalence? It's the same, it's that your device has the same intended use as your predicate device, and either the same technological characteristics, or if there are different technological characteristics, you've submitted information that demonstrates the device is as safe and effective as a legally marketed device, and it doesn't raise new questions or different questions of safety and effectiveness. Importantly, if FDA requests information to demonstrate substantial equivalence, it should constitute the least burdensome means of demonstrating substantial equivalence. Next slide, please. Now, if you do get 510K clearance, and then you go to modify your device, which your 510K cleared device, which happens, of course, all the time. The question is whether the changes that you make are going to trigger the need for a new 510K. And the triggering is if you make significant changes or modifications. So if you make a major change or modification in the intended use of your device, or if you change or modify either your design, your material or composition, etc., that could significantly affect the safety and effectiveness of the device. Now, importantly, manufacturers make this initial determination, should document it, explain why they think a 510K is not required, that these requirements haven't been triggered. But FDA can disagree, and FDA can disagree either if a competitor submits a complaint to FDA and says, oh, you know, we see X company is marketing this device, but we don't think they have a clearance for it, or FDA, if they come in and inspect and they look at these letters to file, is what they're referred to, and disagrees. And then the agency may come back to you and say, we disagree, we think you need to submit a 510K. Next slide, please. There's another type of marketing authorization application, which is referred to as Denovo classification requests. And these are for novel devices, but they're low to moderate risk devices. There are a couple ways that a company can request Denovo classification. One is if the company's gone through the 510K process and FDA has found that the device is not substantially equivalent, the manufacturer could then turn around and say, look, we think this is low to moderate risk, it's novel, can we go the de novo route? Also, if there's no predicate available to the manufacturer in the first instance, they may go directly to FDA, not submit a 510K, but submit a de novo classification request. It's the information required to be submitted is similar to what you would put in a 510K, but you do need to provide the reasons for your recommended classification and include a draft proposal for special controls if they're required. FDA has about 120 days to classify the device. Again, sometimes the agency hits this target, sometimes not. But if your device is classified through the de novo process, it then may be used as a 510K predicate. So in other words, another company could come along, submit a 510K and claim your de novo device as a predicate device. Again, I've listed here the user fees for this fiscal year, notably higher than for the fees for a 510K. Next slide, please. And finally, the most rigorous type of marketing application that FDA has. It's the pre-market approval application, or PMA. And this is akin to an NDA for drugs or BLA for biologics. It's applicable to most class 3 devices, and it does require FDA approval. There are extensive content requirements, and most PMA devices do require clinical studies. There are some 510Ks devices and Denovo devices that would require clinical studies, but almost all PMA devices require clinical studies. Again, I've got the user fees listed here. Again, much higher than what you see for the Denovo and the 510K. And also, PMA devices, FDA will conduct pre-approval inspection, will go to the manufacturing facility, and may also conduct a BIMO audit of your clinical trial sites. Next slide, please. FDA has 45 days to do an initial review of the PMA and determine whether it should be filed, which then would trigger a more in-depth review. Again, FDA targets 180 days to review PMAs. In reality, usually PMAs take much longer. FDA can ask for more information. If the information is significant, it may be submitted through what's called a major amendment, which would restart the PMA review clock. Applicants can request what are called day 100 meetings, which is basically an opportunity to talk with FDA, find out if there are deficiencies, and try and address those. FDA may also refer a PMA to an advisory committee, which is a panel of outside experts that will talk about the submission and give a recommendation to the agency. The agency doesn't have to take the recommendation, doesn't have to agree with the recommendation, but certainly takes it under consideration. Now, for a PMA, FDA would either issue an approval order, which would cite the indications, any limitations, including in the warning, in the labeling. The FDA could also issue an approval letter, approvable letter, which would cite deficiencies the applicant needs to address. Or FDA could cite could issue a not approvable letter, which are usually more significant deficiencies, might require another clinical study, or FDA could deny the PMA. Now, for PMA devices that are approved, FDA could require a post-approval study, and in fact maintains a website of post-approval studies. So next slide, please. Okay, and so finally, assuming you get on the market, again, what are some of the requirements that you need to be, and FDA regulations that you need to be cognizant of? Again, registering your establishment, listing your device, making sure you comply with the labeling requirements found in Part 801. As you may know, labeling is defined very broadly. It can reach exhibit booth panels, it can reach websites. So it's not just materials that are physically provided with the device. And manufacturers cannot engage in off-label promotion. Device manufacturers, once they're on the market, have to have a system for handling complaints, making sure that those are documented and investigated when needed. Again, if there are adverse events, companies may need to submit an MDR, a medical device report, to the agency. If a company needs to do a recall, if they have what's considered a reportable correction or removal, they may need to submit, or they would need to submit what's called a Part 806 report to FDA. And then finally, for class 2 and 3 devices, some of those devices may be subject to post-market tracking or surveillance. And the information on those requirements is found in Parts 821 and 822 of FDA's regs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
And we do have a question, Stephanie,
Oh, thank you.
before we move over. So the question is from Paul. If a de novo classification is refused and a PMA must be performed, will that user fee be rolled over towards the PMA user fee?
No, you'd have to submit a new user fee for the PMA device.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Stephanie. And as Stephanie mentioned, I'm Matt Watts. I'm also a partner at Goodwin Proctor, based in DC. In our healthcare regulatory group, I run our compliance work at Goodwin. I also have the good fortune of leading our medtech practice at Goodwin Proctor. And just to put a quick plug in for our work at Goodwin, we are passionate about the medtech industry and have lawyers who have focused on all aspects of the medtech business, including development and design of medical technology. And you're just hearing from two of us today on the regulatory front, just as you all know, a small swath of issues. And so please feel free to check out our medtech website for more information about our interest and passion in the medical technology industry. I also wanted to share with you, I know that MassMedic had an educational event on Tuesday of this week regarding reimbursement strategy as a driver for valuation. That video is available on MassMedic's YouTube website. And I'm going to just touch very, very lightly on some of those concepts that were covered in the educational event on Tuesday. So I don't mean to duplicate efforts here, but when we think about new medical technology or innovations to existing medical technology, there's two areas of regulatory governance or oversight that oftentimes I think might get moved to the back burner or don't become sort of a primary thought until maybe very close to commercialization or right when you're expecting your regulatory approval. And that is first your market access strategy. How do you plan to have this product reimbursed and covered in the marketplace, and who's going to pay for it? And second, your commercial strategy and the compliance considerations that go into that. All of this derives from a significant number of regulations elsewhere throughout HHS beyond FDA, which Stephanie just shared with us. And so just talking at a very high level about market access, what regulations are at issue here? Well, here we're really focused on the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the Medicare coverage process, and also the coding process as well. Coding is a significant piece of market access. For those of you who don't touch on it on a daily basis, it might be, you might have a great coverage policy from Medicare that's very exciting for your innovation, but if you don't have the right code associated with it, your payment could be very low. And so we typically advise medtech companies to start thinking about your market access strategy and how are you going to follow that Medicare regulatory process early, very early. In fact, we often recommend it just as you're starting your clinical research. Why do we recommend that? Well, for a couple of reasons. First, we understand you're not going to really be focused on the ins and outs of your market access work until a little bit down the road. However, you may find as you do your market access analysis that the product itself, while it might treat a significant illness or disability, it might not at the end of the day be lucrative. There might actually not be a significant number of patients who would benefit. Existing treatment might still be the preferred method. So undertaking that market access strategy is certainly important. And so a little bit about some of the areas that we recommend thinking about when it comes to market access. And again, I would certainly recommend turning to the MassMedic educational program from the other day. But first, defining the clinical problem. Of course, what are you trying to solve for? Is this technology that's revolutionary and disruptive to your current system or current treatment, or is it additive? What will the benefit this proposed solution that you're intending to research and push through the FDA regulatory strategy or regulatory process that Stephanie just outlined, what is that proposed solution? What is it bringing to patients? What's that value? And these questions will really help assess whether there's even a marketplace for the product that would justify the R&D costs that would go into your research. Second, you want to think about place of use. Where is the product going to be used? This will directly determine how much it's paid, how your customers are compensated for procedures that use your product. Maybe it's used in the inpatient setting. Will it be eligible for an additional NTAP payment if it's used in the physician office setting? How can a physician be reimbursed for use of that product in connection with their patients? So thinking about that place of use will help you identify who do you need to be a vocal supporter for the product. What would you be thinking in terms of a range of potential reimbursement rates? Provider stakeholders. So really identify who is going to be the type of physician at this stage who will use your product. And of course, identifying those KOLs that will serve as spokespeople for the coverage process. As part of the Medicare regulatory process for coverage, you have an opportunity to present information from experts, and understanding who are going to be those really key knowledgeable voices early on is important. And then, of course, patient needs. Oh, well, and actually one other point on the provider stakeholders, you will also want to understand who might be a vocal opponent to your product as well, and understanding what those arguments might be early on as you're doing the research might help you, for example, collect some additional evidence during research that could overcome some of those arguments. So just being mindful of the full picture surrounding your market access strategy. Payer policies, of course, thinking about what are the existing Medicare coverage policies that are out there. Can you work within those and maybe circumvent some of the regulatory requirements? And then proof. Of course, we all are aware of the valley of death for med tech. Unfortunately, there is that gap in time where there may not be coverage after an approval or a clearance. And so understanding what additional proof or evidence or documentation that the product is, quote, reasonable and necessary. Of course, that's Medicare standard. Reasonable and necessary for Medicare beneficiaries would be helpful. So just keep that in mind. On the actual sort of regulatory front, of course, you all remember the Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technology, or MCIT, regulations that were issued during the Trump administration, which were proposed, finalized, and then rescinded at the end of 2021. And CMS cited for that a lack of adequate studies for products might result in the payment for products or coverage for products that aren't actually reasonable and necessary for the Medicare population. So CMS was concerned on that front. Of course, wanting the ability to revoke coverage after a positive MCIT decision would be made. And then, just sort of practically, MCIT did not really address coding and payment issues. And so again, that coverage piece is so critical and so key, and something to be so thoughtful of so early on, but without an appropriate code and without adequate payment. Certainly, that would be problematic from a business operations standpoint. We do expect to have new regulations released this year, the Transitional Coverage of Emerging Technology, or TCET, which I think TCET is going to be the new MCIT, and we expect to see some proposed regulations from CMS in October of this year. And what do we expect this to be? Well, just sort of reading the tea leaves from different CMS presentations, public statements, and sort of the light available information out there. I think what we'll find is some additional process around the more traditional coverage with evidence development process that would potentially give companies an opportunity to show early and expeditiously that the product is reasonable and necessary for Medicare beneficiaries. So stay tuned. I think we'll see a lot of movement on that later this year.
And we do have a question, Matt. So the question is, what is the regulatory pathway if we want to combine two 510(k) cleared products with the same intended use, just for the users or healthcare staff convenience?
Sure. No, we can certainly talk about that. Stephanie, I don't know if you have any thoughts from a 510K perspective, or an FDA perspective, rather, I should say.
Yeah, I think, I think it's possible. You'd want to look into whether you need to submit a new 510K, whether there's a potential that you could do a letter to file. I don't think it would necessarily trigger a new Denovo or a PMA. So it's sort of, worth diving into, and you could always try and meet with FDA in advance as part of a pre-sub meeting.
And then from the, the Medicare perspective, it's really going to all depend on whether there's an existing coverage category or benefit for, the resulting product. And of course, whether or not you receive the 510K clearance, or to the extent it's a, PMA approved product, that will of course have a significant bearing on whether you can progress on the Medicare coverage front. And certainly happy to dig into that with whoever asked that question. That's a good one, and crosses over our regulatory pathways quite nicely. Some of the other areas that I did want to cover, and I do think are important for companies to think about early on. Now, this part of the presentation is going to be more for companies who are emerging, who don't have an existing product on the market, who are really focused on new technology and launching a new commercial organization and commercial structure around that product. So what do you need to think about from a compliance perspective when you are growing your commercial organization? Well, first, what are we primarily focused on? We're primarily focused on regulations and guidance from the HHS Office of Inspector General, or OIG, as it implements the federal anti-kickback statute. And in particular, we are focused on two things. First, is there an effective compliance program in place? OIG has issued a significant amount of guidance in that area. We'll touch on that. And then second, are your various interactions with your referral sources, so those physicians, nurse practitioners, and others who are able to order your product or use your product in connection with a procedure, are your relationships with those individuals compliant with the various anti-kickback statute, safe harbors, and the statute itself? And so just thinking about some of those issues, as a former chief compliance officer of an emerging company myself, and having spent significant time working with emerging companies and others on their compliance issues, I think what we've got listed on the slide here are some of the key areas of concern that you should be thoughtful of. And when should you start thinking about these concerns when it comes to commercial organizations? Certainly, as you're going through the FDA regulatory process, that's going to be front and center of your attention and your resources, and rightfully so. However, you'll start to see when commercialization is going to become a reality, and we tend to advise clients to start thinking about these issues about 6 months to 1 year before you think you'll be on the market. And why? Primarily because you want to start getting resources in place. You want to start acclimating your employees to some of these rules and regulations that will come into effect when you are in the market. And it's better to start those habits early. Does it mean that these requirements that we're going to talk about today technically apply to your company? Yes and no, in a certain sense, because they will apply. We typically advise to get ready for it, in other words, about a year in advance. So without delaying it, hiring a commercial organization, what do you want to think about? A couple of things. First, you'll also have a medical organization as well. And this is where I think Stephanie's work on the FDA side and her work with companies on off-label issues and the appropriate role of medical professionals that your company might hire. FDA has requirements around those roles, and you want to make sure that you have an adequate distinction between your commercial organization and your medical organization. Doesn't mean they can't talk to each other, doesn't mean they can't overlap, but having those clear lines allows you to have the medical affairs personnel who can answer off-label questions in a reactive posture, who can engage in peer-to-peer conversations with your customers without that commercial influence. It's an important piece of your commercial setup. Second, as Stephanie mentioned, off-label promotion and making sure that all of your materials comport with the label for your product, and that your sales organizations and marketing organizations' behaviors also comply with those requirements. So you'll need policies, you'll need to have a review committee that casts eyes on all of the materials that are going out the door, and you'll need to train your sales force and your marketing team to make sure they understand very clearly and very distinctly what those lines are. In addition, and this is more of a practical point versus a regulatory point, when you're hiring a commercial organization, oftentimes you'll be hiring folks who have worked previously in the industry. Maybe they've had a job at a med tech company before, maybe they come from the pharmaceutical industry. And one thing you want to make sure of is that they are following your rules, your procedures, and your way of doing things. Oftentimes, these folks have a lot of experience and they've worked with other compliance organizations who maybe they do things differently. Maybe they have a lower risk tolerance. Maybe they have a higher risk tolerance. Maybe they've encouraged or fostered bad behavior previously. You want to make sure that you get rid of that right away and immediately have your commercial organization trained on and following your practices when it comes to compliance. Discounts and rebates, of course, engaging with your customers means those sales that really drive revenue, and we all support, even those of us in compliance. And but part of that is following the rules when it comes to calculating discounts and rebates, and the discount safe harbor to the anti-kickback statute has specific requirements for how you can engage in price concessions with your customers, including appropriate invoice language. When you're offering bundled discounts, there's certain ways to structure that. If you have a piece of capital equipment, for example, and you're also selling disposables, and you want to come up with an innovative price around that, you can do that following some certain rules and guidelines that have developed over time. And then, of course, leases and warranties are certainly part of the commercial practice when it comes to specific types of equipment in the medtech industry. Of course, not everybody offers a lease for their equipment. Oftentimes, capital equipment will have a leasing component to it. But if you're purchasing or selling rather, discrete individual products that are implantable, for example, and don't have a capital component, you're probably not engaging in lease arrangements. You might have some consignment arrangements. Consignment is another area that is subject to the anti-kickback statute and the safe harbor regulations there. Sales reps and clinical reps in the operating room. This is still something that we see with our clients. I think for many of our med tech clients, having that direct technical support in the operating room as complicated equipment is being used in a very sensitive way is a very important part of the medical technology industry, and plays a significant role in making sure that effective and safe care is delivered to patients. Of course, what are some of the concerns? There could be off-label marketing concerns if a sales rep is asked to support a procedure that's off-label. You want to be cognizant of that. The practice of medicine, of course, our sales reps, we may have some very highly educated sales reps. We may even have some sales reps or clinical reps who have MDs, but they are not physicians in this context and should not be practicing medicine or guiding or advising the operator of the equipment, the actual physician performing the procedure. And then products liability, certainly that additional touch point could have an impact on your exposure from a products liability standpoint. So all of these issues, in addition to the anti-kickback statute concerns of perhaps performing services that a physician should perform himself or herself, so you want to be mindful of where those lines are drawn. What is the specific role of that rep in the OR? Incentive compensation for sales. This has been an area of recent development when it comes to the safe harbor regulations. So of course, there's two applicable safe harbor regulations. There is the employee safe harbor under the anti-kickback statute, and that protects any remuneration paid to a bona fide employee. OIG has defined this to be W-2 employees. So if you have a W-2 sales rep, your incentive compensation should be protected under that safe harbor. If you have 1099 sales agents or distributors you have not fully employed as W-2 employees, your sales force, that incentive compensation needs to be structured to meet the personal services safe harbor to the anti-kickback statute, which requires just a little bit more detail there, written contract, and you want to be cautious of that compensation varying with the volume or value of sales that are generated. And the government's taken a recent more increased interest here. The Mallory case, for example, is one you might hear under which the DOJ has taken a very strict approach to incentive compensation for 1099 sales organizations. So be mindful of that. Of course, some of the others on the right here, I'm not going to go into too much detail just because of time here, but all of these are the types of interactions with your customers that we see regularly and I know are contemplated as you build out your operational approach. Grants and donations, you want to have controls around those to ensure that your support for educational programs, for charitable programs, for independent research align with the federal anti-kickback statute and are not viewed as or intended to be some sort of disguised inducement or bribe to your customers. One quick note on this, OIG has recently made, in fact, just over the past couple of weeks, some statements in the form of an advisory opinion about medical device and pharmaceutical companies' support for educational programs, continuing educational programs. CME grants are certainly a mainstay of the work that our companies do in the medtech industry. OIG, though, has said that when those programs are run by and operated by healthcare organizations that are referral sources, in other words, think of a large health system that puts on a continuing education program for affiliated physicians, and they seek drug or device company sponsorship. OIG is, in its most recent advisory opinion, 2214, has made clear that it views those with a skeptical eye. So be mindful of controls around your grants and donations, training for HCPs via company conducted education programs, the technical training programs that, as we know, as medical technology companies, are so significant and important for HCPs to understand this complicated technology that we offer. OIG has indicated also that it will view those with a skeptical eye under the anti-kickback statute and the safe harbor regulations. So just be mindful of controls that you'll need to have in place for those programs, policies and training for your organization to make sure that that everything is structured appropriately. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means that it needs to follow a specific process and have a specific structure and controls around it. Some of the other areas, evaluation and sample products, obviously providing samples, especially when in that capital equipment and disposable context that we talked about previously, samples and providing a limited evaluation window of time for a health system or a provider to kind of kick the tires around capital equipment in particular, or other types of medical technology. Very common practice, certainly can be done, but there are some contractual requirements to put in place, including keeping the evaluation period limited, making sure that there's nobody billing or submitting claims for procedures performed in connection with evaluation products, and really having a legitimate, reasonable need for that evaluation or that sample is very helpful in ensuring that those items of value are not viewed as kickbacks or inducements. And I'm happy to talk about any of this in greater detail, but in the interest of time, I'm going to fly through the next couple of slides here. We've listed in the slides, and you'll have a copy of these, some of the key laws and regulations that we're talking about here. I think on this slide is particularly critical, the federal anti-kickback statute. We've got some concepts associated with that here on the right, the False Claims Act, and you can see that the False Claims Act has just continued to be a significant enforcement tool for the government, especially when it comes to these issues that we're talking about. The Sunshine Act, I'm going to talk for a minute about this, a couple of slides down the road here, but the Sunshine Act has just grown in such significant importance. But don't forget as well that the states also have anti-kickback statutes, some of which do not turn on whether there's Medicare or Medicaid reimbursement. They also have, some states have gift bans and transparency requirements. So industry standards. I think if you're an emerging company, and again, I know that we probably have a significant number of established companies with multiple products on the market. I'm talking right now to the emerging companies that are just getting started and trying to feel their way through some of this. The AdvaMed code, the MDMA code, those associations do have good industry standards for a lot of these issues that I'm talking about, the commercial compliance consideration. So I would recommend turning to the AdvaMed and MDMA codes for a good sense of kind of where the industry has landed on baseline compliance principles. The Sunshine Act, and I often get a lot of questions from companies that are, maybe several years from the marketplace about when they need to comply with the Sunshine Act, and I really appreciate the eagerness on this particular issue. The Sunshine Act will become applicable for medical technology companies when there's Medicare reimbursement available for your product. So you have to have an approved or cleared product and Medicare reimbursement available, and that Sunshine Act requirement will start 6 months after that moment. So there is a little bit of a grace period there. And what does it mean? There's no behavioral restrictions on the Sunshine Act. In other words, it doesn't say you can or you can't do something. It just says if you do it, you have to disclose it. And what is it? It is making any payment or any transfer of value to an HCP. That could be a consulting payment, a meal, travel, education, a grant, etc. All of that has to be disclosed. We've been doing this now for close to 10 years, but it still remains a source of regulatory obligation for medtech companies. And it's something you should start preparing for, getting your systems, training, and policies in place prior to commercialization. Similarly, state transparency requirements. Many of the states out there do require drug and device companies to disclose annually certain payments and transfers of value to HCPs who are licensed in those states, and the regulations here are pretty light, but they do also have sort of a wide breadth. And so while most of these states have been largely preempted by the Sunshine Act, there still could be some aspect of reporting. For example, in Massachusetts, an HCP type that's not captured under the Sunshine Act, you would still have to report under Massachusetts. And then there are several states that have laws that are applicable beyond devices that apply to drugs. And I have not listed those here, but there's similar requirements in the drug industry as well. Be mindful of your distributor licensure requirements. It's a significant undertaking with the applications that can take some time for approval among state regulators. And then, of course, maintaining those licenses also will require some compliance resources as well as you build out. I'm not going to go into this slide, but I'm always happy to talk about compliance program development. This is sort of an overview of what you need to know when it comes to a compliance program and what your aspirational goals should be. And I think we've reached the end of our slide deck here. We have a couple of minutes left, 2 minutes left on the clock. And so if there's any questions for me or for Stephanie, we're happy to take them.
That's great. We do have one in the chat right now. The question is, can we give a gift card about $50 to doctors in return for a survey related to a marketed product?
Great question. And what I would say is that, I certainly can't advise on the cost and whether $50 reflects the fair market value of those services. But just like any payment made to an HCP in exchange for services, this would even if a nominal $50 payment would be considered a consulting fee. And your best bet is to align that with the personal services safe harbor to the anti-kickback statute, have some sort of very brief written agreement that describes the services. You'd want to do a quick analysis, independent analysis to see whether that $50 actually reflects the amount of time that's being provided for the survey. So you can do it, but you should put a little process around it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I think that is it for questions. What a great presentation. Thank you again. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar to everyone that registered. So with that, thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you to Goodwin for their support. We can't put on wonderful events like this without support from our sponsors. So thank you. And lastly, I encourage you to go to massmedic.com to find out more about different events happening and other educational opportunities like this. So thank you all so much for joining us, and see you next time.